Well, as everybody knows, there were colonists that came to this country in the 1600s. And if you had a fire in the wintertime and you were a colonist on the eastern seaboard and you got burned out, you were in deep trouble because the nearest assistance was clear across the Atlantic Ocean. One of the first institutions that went into place was a volunteer fire company. And in those days, it was neighbor helping neighbor. They really weren't organizations like we would think of them today. One of the first things that actually began to put a structure to a fire organization was called the Rattle Watch. And what the Rattle Watch was a group of people who had this wooden rattle that they would walk the streets with at night. And when a fire broke out, they'd whirl this rattle. It sounded like one of those Halloween devices that kids have. And that would alert the community, and everybody would run out in the street. And they had a command in those days called throw out your buckets. And everybody would throw their buckets out in the street because people had fire buckets in their homes. And when a fire occurred, everybody joined in. The person that we, generally speaking, credit with kind of organizing all that was Benjamin Franklin. In 1736, he formed a volunteer fire brigade in Philadelphia. And then shortly thereafter, almost every community, they started organizing a brigade. Well, the very first firefighting appliances other than bucket brigades were called hand pumpers. The first one was actually imported into this country from England. And what they were little boxes on wheels. And they had a pump on them that was operated by the volunteers. And how they would operate them initially was that the bucket brigades would fill up the little cistern or little tub, as it were, and then they would operate this device to go back and forth to create pump pressure. And most of the early machines, as they called them, didn't have fire hose to them. They had the nozzle attached right to the top of the pump, which meant you had to get the appliance fairly close to the fire to do any good. Now, fire hose itself was invented in Europe by the Dutch. And once they figured out how to do that, then they started adding hose connections, and these hand pumpers got bigger and more volunteers were taken to operate them. The initial ones were about the size of a little bit larger than a wheelbarrow. And they grew to a fairly monumental size. I've actually seen hand pumpers that take as many as 30 people to operate. In most of the metropolitan areas, the fire stations started to crop up. Most of it was driven by the community itself. Many of the volunteer fire departments were based on ethnicity. They were based on economic conditions. They were often very competitive. And the volunteer fire departments in those days sort of answered to nobody but themselves.